David investigates perceptual development, development of vision, and development of cross-modal integration, as well as how they are related to the learning of the characteristics of objects, speech, language, social perception, etc. He got his BA from Brandeis, his PhD from the City University of New York, and did a postdoctoral fellowship at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, Association for Psychological Science. Those fellowships recognize his fundamental work on perceptual development. And like me, he had his turn at being president of the International Congress of Infant Studies. He organized that meeting when it occurred in Baltimore about 6 years ago. 22. And I organized it for Berlin 2 years ago. And it's an organization that specializes in development during infancy.
Good morning, and I thank Daphne and Takao for inviting me to take part in this fascinating symposium. And I hope I have something to contribute to this in terms of synesthesia. As you can tell, most of my talk will actually be concerned with the development of multisensory perception and its underlying mechanisms, and thereby what I hope to do is I hope to get us thinking about how the development of these sorts of mechanisms relates in particular to synesthesia. So multisensory integration is, of course, a fundamental property of the CNS. And of course, infants must be able to integrate multisensory inputs if they are to avoid William James's famous blooming, buzzing confusion. And of course, if they are to have coherent experiences. So for example, for the baby here, this is not just a face and a voice, it's mom. And in order for them to come up with this unified concept of mom, needless to say, they have to integrate those two inputs together as a coherent entity. So of course we know, and again, I'm going to be probably repeating some of these basic facts, but then again, you know, when you follow after other people, this is what happens. So apparently redundancy is not a bad thing. So of course we know that the nervous system is initially immature and sparsely connected, and that the brain grows most rapidly during the first 3 years of life. And we also know that as the brain grows, neural connections increase massively, and some of these are, of course, exuberant connections. And ultimately, of course, these exuberant connections are pruned away, resulting in fewer connections. So that's the developmental story. Now, what I would like to do today is I would like to focus on the first year of life and on the time when the nervous system is immature and overconnected or hyperconnected, when infants are inexperienced, and when the sensory systems are functionally limited. And so in order to begin a discussion of what's going on during that first year of life, I'd like to ask two critical questions. One is, what developmental mechanisms are involved in the acquisition of multisensory processing skills in typical development? And two, what perceptual mechanisms are involved in the extraction of multisensory coherence in infancy? So let's start with the developmental mechanisms question. And of course, as already you've heard multiple times now this morning, plasticity, both neural and behavioral, is key to understanding the developmental mechanisms. And of course, experience is also key in here. So let me give you some examples of that sort of provide the evidence for making these sorts of claims. For example, the spatial tuning of the acoustic neurons in the ferret infant superior colliculus depends on visual input. They need to have visual input in order to align themselves properly. Likewise, the multisensory neurons in the superior colliculus of both cats and monkeys are not present at birth. As you can see here, there are none here at birth, and their ability to integrate emerges slowly over development, and they require coordinated audiovisual experience for proper functioning. And this is one of my favorite studies. This is the Magrinka-Sur study showing that if you redirect retinal projections to auditory thalamus and cortex, you can induce visual responsiveness. So here you have the normal pathways, of course, are the lateral geniculate nucleus, lateral posterior nucleus, and superior colliculus that ends up in the visual cortex. But if you rewire one of the visual inputs into the medial geniculate nucleus and thereby go into auditory cortex, you can actually, in a neonatal brain, ferret brain, you can get visual responsiveness in auditory cortex. So there's a great deal of plasticity there. And likewise, we have evidence from children, from humans, showing that children who are born deaf and who do not receive cochlear implants prior to 2.5 years of age, they do not subsequently integrate audiovisual inputs, speech rather. Likewise, adults who had congenital cataracts for several months during infancy also do not integrate audiovisual speech. And finally, children who have autism, those are children who typically avoid looking at faces. Those children also have been shown to have difficulties integrating audiovisual speech. So overall, what these studies then suggest is that the perception of multisensory coherence depends on early experience with congruent auditory and visual inputs. Now, let's then shift to a consideration of the perceptual mechanisms that are developing in early infancy and ask what congruence really means. So congruent can mean either that auditory and visual inputs are synchronized in time and space, they just go together in time and space, and that it really doesn't matter what specific attributes they specify. Anything that goes together in time and space can, in principle, be bound together, essentially. And we'll call this low-level congruence. On the other hand, we can also have congruence in terms of equivalence, where equivalence is based on specific perceptual attributes, such as, for example, duration, tempo, prosody, gender, affect, identity. All of those higher level features are features that we as human beings must be able to extract from our audiovisual events and must be able to combine them together in order to perceive our coherent world. So for example, our faces, of course, contain all of these sorts of information here, and we need to be able to perceive that they're equivalent cross modalities and integrate them together to make sense of our social partners, if you will. So given this distinction, we can then ask what sort of multisensory processing is possible in early infancy. So we're going to focus here. And of course, on the one hand, sensory limitations only permit the perception of low-level audiovisual congruence. On the other hand, of course, exuberant connections may make synesthesia possible, as was suggested by Daphne. So let's have a look at some of this evidence here and ask, what sorts of general evidence? So what I want to do here is I want to preview what I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about. So in general, studies have found that early in infancy, multisensory processing is characterized by responsiveness to these low-level kinds of congruence cues, and that later in infancy, multisensory processing is characterized by the emergence of responsiveness to higher-level congruence cues. And this is a gradual emerging process that occurs during infancy. So if that is the case, then where does neonatal synesthesia fit in? And that's the question really that we're trying to consider here. And so when reflecting on this, I thought, well, synesthesia, of course we know that synesthesia reflects the automatic formation of these multisensory associations along these specific dimensions. So for example, pitch and height, pitch and shape, color and shape, and all of those, the color grapheme synesthesia, all those forms of synesthesia, of course, are well known now, but those seem to reflect specific kinds of connections being made here. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that synesthesia is different from synchrony-based kind of multisensory responsiveness because the latter is not restricted, as I pointed out already, to the association of these privileged or specific dimensions. That is to say, if all you're responding to is the co-occurrence of inputs in different modalities in time and in space, you really don't care about what those are. So that's really the distinction I'm drawing here. And synesthesia also seems to be different from equivalence-based kinds of responsiveness because the latter requires that the multisensory dimensions be equivalent, as I said, so duration, prosody, identity. It seems to me that, now in this particular case, we can in fact, I'd like to discuss this more later on because I'm not sure that one can draw a hard and fast distinction here, perhaps. And I see Daphne nodding in agreement. So I do see the overlaps in some sense, and I'd like to discuss this later on. So let me just go now through some of the evidence that we've obtained in our lab and other people have obtained over the years that characterizes what happens in early development. And I'm going to go back to my earliest work, which is actually my dissertation work. I'm dating myself here. But this work actually is cited a good deal by Daphne and others in the synesthesia field as evidence perhaps of early synesthesia in infancy. So in this particular study, what we did is we used a habituation test procedure. So with babies, we essentially have two kinds of methods that we use to ask them questions indirectly, one of which is the habituation test procedure, which is simply you bore the heck out of a baby first. So you habituate them to some stimulus, present it over and over again, you monitor attention, and when attention wanes, you then present something novel, and presumably if the baby can make a distinction between what they learned initially during habituation and the novel event, they will show you response recovery. So the slides I'm going to be showing you are going to be showing you response recovery. The other method that we use is preferential looking. So we simply measure how much time babies prefer to look at one stimulus versus another. Those are the two behavioral methods that we use that are really quite powerful in getting inside the baby's head, if you will. So here we habituate babies to this constant white light over and over again. And then we presented babies with sounds of different intensities between 70 and 80 dB. And one of the things that we did initially is we also ran a bunch of adults where we asked those adults to tell us which of these sounds might be most equivalent to that light. Okay, so we had an a priori match here, and most adults reported that 74 dB matched our light. Okay, so we already knew where perhaps we might be able to expect a match. And what you also expect in babies is that if infants are simply given sounds of increasing intensity, they should show you this monotonically increasing response function. They should respond more and more because the sounds are more intense. Okay. Now, what we actually obtained was something like this, where babies showed the least amount of response recovery to the 74 dB sound, which happens to be equivalent to the light, and showed greater response recovery on both sides. So what this suggests is that these babies, and these are 3 to 4 week old babies, so they're essentially neonates, are already treating auditory visual inputs based on this very simple low level stimulus property as intensity as equivalent. Okay? And this would suggest that there's some sort of a state of syncretic unity of the senses, a la Heinz Werner, okay, who, of course, Heinz Werner talked a lot about synesthesia and primitive cultures and what have you, and in development as well. So this was certainly consistent with that, okay? So in later studies, I began to ask questions about other kinds of features of the world that babies might be responsive to. And of course, as I already mentioned, synchrony is one of those basic features. So what we did is we habituated babies to a bouncing object, such as this one, and we let them watch this as much as they wanted to until they exhibited response habituation. And then we presented these test trials where the sound occurs prior to the visible bounce for some amount of time. And what we obtained was that by the time, if we made the desynchronization at 350 milliseconds here, so if we desynchronize the auditory visual stimuli as much as 350 milliseconds, babies showed a nice response recovery here, meaning that they discriminated between the habituation stimulus, which was synchronous, and this one, which was desynchronized. Okay? And just to give you an idea, what adults do in this particular case, adults can discriminate this as low as 80 milliseconds. So adults are much, much better at this. But the good news is that babies are sensitive to these kinds of temporal audiovisual relations. Okay. Well, in subsequent studies, I began to wonder, well, what about the speech domain? Because, of course, simple bouncing objects are one thing, but speech, language are a whole other dimension of the baby's life, and of course that's part of their social life. So what happens there? So what we did is we habituated babies to this person doing this, just saying a simple ba over and over again. Ba. And this would continue for as long as the baby was willing to attend to it. And then we presented a bunch of test trials ba, where now the sound precedes the visible articulation by 366 milliseconds. Here's 500. Ba. okay?
Ba,
And 666.
ba,
This is about where my PowerPoint crashes,
ba.
okay? And what we found was that it was not until we presented them with an asynchrony of 666 milliseconds, 2/3 of a second, that babies showed significant response recovery, i.e. discrimination. Now, of course, that is, just for comparison, we adults can do this at 120 milliseconds. So again, the good news is that babies are sensitive to audiovisual relations in speech, but they're much, much worse than we adults are, and we can talk about the psychological present and what have you. This raises some very interesting questions about consciousness, if you will, but I don't have time to talk about this here. So then we also did some studies where we were wondering about babies' ability to integrate spatiotemporal kinds of events. So here is a well-known phenomenon. This is actually an illusion, so I'm going to give it away. Most people in this particular case report that those two objects are bouncing against one another, but it's an illusion because in fact they're passing right through one another. So this is Bob Sekuler's paper back in 1997 in Nature. So this is an illusion. About 70% of the people report bouncing here. So we wondered, when does this develop? And does it develop in infancy? If babies can actually perceive these sorts of things, and that would suggest that they can perceive spatiotemporal audiovisual congruency based on audiovisual synchrony relations. So we habituated them to this. Okay, we measured and we tested 4, 6, and 8-month-old babies. We measured how much attention they paid to this. And then we presented this event where the sound occurs way before those two objects overlap one another. So therefore, this is an event that most of you would report under laboratory conditions, not here. Under laboratory conditions, you would report that these are not bouncing anymore. Okay? And what we obtained was clear evidence of response recovery at the two older ages, at 6 months and at 8 months, but not at 4 months, suggesting that it's beginning to emerge at 6 months. But just to make sure, we also presented this event, okay, where the sound occurs post-coincidence. And again, babies should show response recovery if they can discriminate this as being different from the bounce, illusory bounce event. And what we found was that the 4-month-olds did exhibit response recovery, but of course this is not systematic, whereas here 6-month-olds and 8-month-olds exhibited very clear response recovery. Again, this suggests here that the ability to perceive these spatiotemporal audiovisual relations only emerges at around 6 months of age, but nonetheless this is quite early, and it suggests that babies are beginning to perceive their audiovisual world as a coherent place starting about this age when it comes to these sorts of events. Well, perhaps, but what about localization? So what we did here is we asked the following question. Of course, babies operate in a world that's full of sights and sounds that are spatially distributed. They have to localize those objects and the sounds that they make. So the question is, how good are they at this? And is it possible that auditory visual information, which presents them with redundancy, will it help them localize things more quickly than if they are specified just by auditory visual cues? So we had babies sitting in this sort of an apparatus here where we had LEDs, flashing lights, and producing sounds through a speaker here, presented either at 25 degrees or 45 degrees eccentricity, and we simply measured response latencies, head turns, and eye turns. So we were just measuring how quickly it would take the baby to orient to those stimuli, either when they were auditory only, visual only, or audiovisual. And this is a busy slide, but what I'd like you to notice is that responsiveness to the combined auditory and visual stimulation is greater than to stimulation in other modality alone. Or put differently, they're faster, right? So you can see that the latencies are faster to the audiovisual inputs over development, okay, during the first year of life. But one of the interesting things that we found was that it was not until 8 to 10 months of age that infants actually they actually violated the race rule, which means that response latency to the audiovisual inputs was a nonlinear sum of auditory visual response latency. So this is the first place by 8 months of age that babies are showing these kinds of redundancy effects when it comes to their multisensory spatial world and localizing things in it. Okay? So it takes quite a while to get there. But nonetheless, they're showing some they're sort of, the behavior before this is already beginning to suggest that they're beginning to get to that point. Now, up until this point, I've been talking about infants' ability to perceive congruence of auditory visual inputs that is really quite simple. Simple bouncing objects, perhaps a single phoneme being spoken and what have you. But what about the real world out there? The kind of information that infants have to actually deal with on a daily basis, and that is people talking to them, okay? And if you look at the multisensory literature in early development, what you find are a series of studies that have looked at babies' ability to perceive the equivalence, if you will, between auditory and visual speech inputs, and usually those are single syllables, single phonemes. But there are no real investigations of babies' response to fluent speech, and this is what they really need to deal with on a daily basis. So we asked that question in the following manner.
Good morning. Get up. Come on now. If you get up right away, we'll have an hour to putter around.
So, and this went on and on and on. I can recite this in my sleep. If you wake me up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I will recite it for you because I've heard it so many times. But all we do in this particular case is we sit babies in front of this video and we simply score how much time they look at each one, with the assumption being that if they can determine that this is the face that they're hearing, talking, then they should look longer at it. That should elicit more attention. And what we found was the following. Now, these are, what I'm saying here is 12 to 14-month-olds. We've tested in this particular study 4 to 6-month-olds, 8 to 10-month-olds, and 12 to 14-month-olds. Only as late as the first year of life, at first birthday, did we find evidence that these babies were making the match. So here what you can see is that the babies are looking longer at this face talking when they're hearing the audio track at the same time than they looked at that same face in silence. Okay? So they increase their looking at the face when they hear the audio track. In the first block of trials, these are English learning monolingual babies. By the second block of trial, this goes away because these are 12-month-olds. They're bored. They want out of there. Okay? But here's something really interesting. If we presented our English-speaking, English-learning monolingual babies with videos of people speaking in Spanish now, okay, and remember, these are babies, and you've already heard from Daphne about perceptual narrowing. By the first year of life, babies are narrowing to their own native inputs. If you present them with Spanish speech now, what you find is that they don't make that match during the first block of trials. It takes them a little bit longer to extract that particular concordance between the auditory and visual information. Now, we also ran a study where we desynchronized those two, the auditory and the visual information, and it turns out that the babies were still able to make the match when it was the English speech, but they no longer were able to make the match when it was Spanish, suggesting that what they're doing by this age is they're extracting the prosody information. They no longer rely on these low-level cues. They don't have to. They now can extract this thing called prosody that everyone talks about, the rhythmicity of the speech, if you will, and they can map them onto one another. So, okay, well, conventional wisdom says that early development is progressive, right? And we know that as we grow, our sensory, perceptual, cognitive, affective, and social abilities improve. Of course, everybody accepts that notion. But of course, this is not the full developmental story, because the converse turns out is just as important. And in fact, this is the big theme running through this whole meeting, right? That this pruning of exuberant connections and what have you is taking place during early development. So we also know that early development is a regressive affair, so sometimes the species-specific experience can have paradoxical effects, leading to regression of functional capacity, and as has been suggested here multiple times now, perhaps due to neural pruning of these exuberant connections. So, to get at this question in the multisensory domain, what we did a number of years ago is we did this very simple study again where we presented babies with these monkey faces vocalizing. Okay, so what we did is first we presented this monkey face. It's the same monkey producing two different vocalizations, a grunt here and a coo here. And we measured amount of looking at these two. Then we presented them in sound. Okay, so there's that coo. And the question is, would babies look at the correct face here? And then we presented the grunt. And again, the question is, would they look at the correct face here? And what we found, surprisingly, well, we kind of expected it and hoped that it would work, but we were pleasantly surprised that it worked. And what we found was that babies at 4 and 6 months of age did indeed look longer at the face that was producing the correct vocalization together with vocalization rather than in comparison to the face when it was presented in silence. So they increased their looking when they were listening to the vocalization. At 6 months, the same thing was true, so they were doing matching. But by 8 months and 10 months, this was gone. That difference was no longer significant. So here's evidence. This was our first evidence of this multisensory perceptual narrowing taking place in infancy. We also followed this study up with a study where we asked, well, is it possible that maybe what's driving this is, in fact, is this low-level synchrony? Because you probably noticed, if you were paying really good attention here, as our babies were, that the vocalizations that were being presented with the silent articulations of those vocalizations were in perfect synchrony and not synchronized with the opposite one. And indeed, this is what babies were attending to. If you desynchronize them, the matching went away. Okay? Just to make sure now, remember that the babies that we tested here, the youngest ones were 4 months of age, just to make sure that this was indeed something that was present at birth, this sort of low-level form of responsiveness. We then did a study with Francesca Simeon with newborns where we did exactly the same thing, and we found the same results. We found that even newborn babies do this sort of matching of these kinds of faces and vocalizations. But now we wondered, is it possible that our babies, having already done this study where we desynchronized them and knowing that in fact synchrony was driving this effect, we wondered if our newborns were cheating, if you will, and were fooling us. And so what we did is we did another study where we substituted tones for the vocalization. So we took away all the identity information in the auditory signal. We stripped that spectral information, but notice that they still have the same durations and therefore they're synchronized. And what we found was indeed the newborns still did the matching, suggesting that in fact what the newborns are doing is indeed exactly what I suggested before, which is they're simply responding to the fact that something in my visual system, my auditory system, comes on and off at the same time. If they do, why don't I bind it? Because who knows, I might discover something more interesting as I keep learning about it. They don't say that, but of course this is what happens in development. Now, this business of cross-species multisensory perception and its narrowing raises some interesting questions, right? Certainly babies are not exposed to monkey faces very often, so perhaps that's not such a surprising finding. But what about human faces and speech that may not be familiar to them? So what we did is we exposed babies to silent videos, on one side saying ba, the other side saying va, multiple times. We switched them, measured amount of looking. We then familiarized them with a ba, and then presented the faces in silence again, familiarized them with ba again, presented the faces again, measured looking. And what we found was that our English learning babies, monolingual English learning babies, were matching again. They're looking longer at the face that matches the particular phoneme that they were hearing at 6 and 11 months of age. But when we tested babies who were Spanish learning babies in Spain, in Barcelona, what we found was that they were matching at 6 months of age, but no longer at 11 months of age. So again, here's evidence of this perceptual narrowing now in the audiovisual speech domain. And the reason that they no longer responded to this in Spain was because the ba and the va is a homonym, is a homophone in Spanish. They're not different sounds, so it just goes away through experience. So let me get to the final part of my talk and show you now how infants actually one of the ways in which infants get at the perceptual multisensory coherence of their world is through the development of selective attentional mechanisms. So
Good
here,
morning.
you've seen this already and
Get
heard this
up.
before, but now what
Come
we've
on
got
now, if you get up right away,
is
we'll
an eye
have an
tracker
hour
here.
to potter
So
around.
we're now asking the following question. If you present babies with someone who's talking, what parts of that talking phase do they attend to? And what we found was this really remarkable shift in selective attention, where at 4 months of age, the babies were looking primarily at the eyes, but somewhere in here, by 8 and 10 months of age, babies shift their attention to the mouth, and they begin to essentially lip read as the person is talking. And of course, this makes perfect sense because this is where babbling begins and endogenous attentional mechanisms are beginning to emerge. So therefore, babies can now begin to select what kind of information they are going to attend to. And they're so interested in speech now because they're babbling. So they're trying to learn their native word forms, if you will. Now, something interesting also happens here is that you notice that there seems to be a shift back to the eyes, because here are adults. And of course, this is the time when babies are becoming experts in their native language. So presumably by this time, they don't need to rely on this audiovisual redundancy as much as they do when they first start to babble. Now,
Buenos días.
we also did this.
Despiértate ya. Vamos. Si te levantas ahora, tendremos una hora para jugar en la casa.
And we went on. And we replicated our findings here, except, so remember, these are our monolingual English learning babies. And something really interesting happens. When it becomes unfamiliar speech at 12 months of age, because they've narrowed, they continue to lip read. In fact, they do more of it than before, okay? So they're taking advantage of their selective attentional abilities now to try to extract as much information as they can out of the stimulus, and all of this is modulated by their experience. So let me close out by running through these slides. In the last set of studies we've done, again, this is my colleagues in Barcelona who have done these studies. They repeated these selective attentional looking studies, but now with babies who are learning either one language, Spanish or Catalan, or learning both of them. And we looked to see what they did in this particular case. And you can see when they're getting one of their native languages, they show that same shift to the mouth at 8 months of age, and there's no significant response here anymore, okay? But now if you present the bilingual babies with these kinds of stimuli, bilingual babies actually at 12 months of age are doing a great deal of lip reading. So in fact, again, bilingual babies who are struggling to keep two linguistic systems apart, trying to figure out two different systems, are in fact relying on their selective attentional abilities to extract the audiovisual coherence and redundancy from the stimulus. So bilinguals continue to lip read. Now, if you present these babies, monolinguals, with English now, so these are Spanish or Catalan learning babies, but you present them with an English person talking, they continue to lip read here at 12 months of age. That is consistent with what we found before. And if you present bilingual babies with English, they actually do significantly more lip reading at this late age here. So, finally, this is really the final study here. In the latest work that we've done, what we've asked is it possible that the audiovisual synchrony that is present in typical audiovisual speech that we present to our infants, is it possible that that might drive some of this attention, these attentional shifts? And indeed, it does, because these are data from a study where we desynchronize the auditory and visual soundtrack, and what you get is that at 10 months of age, you no longer get significant lip reading going on here. So it seems as if at 10 months of age, when babies are at the threshold of starting to speak and really begin to use speech and language in a meaningful way, they really seem to rely on the coherence, the audiovisual coherence of the speech signal. So the infant's world, therefore, is a thoroughly multisensory place where people can be seen and heard talking, and inanimate objects can be seen moving and making sounds. Initially, none of these are familiar, but as neural development progresses and as infants gain increasingly greater experience with their world, the talking people and moving sounding objects become more familiar and begin to have meaning and even affective valence. And acquisition, of course, of increasing expertise requires that infants perceive the coherence of their multisensory world. So we know that rudimentary but powerful multisensory processing mechanisms operate early in infancy, and that those supposedly bootstrap then infants' ability to detect coherence and thus enable them to have unitary experience. And we also know that the rudimentary low-level response mechanisms give rise to the emergence of higher-level mechanisms that enable infants to differentiate and learn higher-level forms of multisensory coherence, and therefore they're able to now begin to pick up things like gender, affect, identity, prosody across modalities, and really begin to extract those. And we finally know that experience contributes critically to the development of multisensory processing through this paradoxical process of perceptual narrowing, and that this process leads to the emergence of multisensory perceptual expertise. And finally, we know that infants acquire selective attention strategies that enable them to seek out the redundant and thus the most salient audiovisual cues for the acquisition of speech and language. I'll end there. Thank you. Yes.
Wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One quick comment.
Whoops.
Can you see?
Wait.
Well, thank you very much. A wonderful talk.
Thank you.
You know, I compare those UCLA, the neurology in the child development, you know, using the PET scan, positron emission tomography. And, you know, the interesting finding by Chugani for decades, you know, of, seizuring measure when they, you know, doing the almost a direct measurement. And they find the peak of the dendritic field, you know, development in infants. You know, the dendritic field peak around the age of 5.
Around?
I wish 5 years old.
Right.
You know, I wish your data can extend, you know, from beyond 12 months. You know, there will be a window that we can compare those visual cortex versus auditory cortex in the human development and parallel with your PL, you know, score study in behavioral measure.
Well, one of the things, so I don't want to neurologize too much because all of our work, as you can see, is behavioral, but I will say this, that one of the things that is important to keep in mind is that our data certainly don't suggest that this sort of development is finished by 12 months of age. It's far from finished. So there are studies with children, older studies. Herb Birch and other people did studies way back when in the 60s and 70s, showing that during childhood, many of these sorts of abilities are still emerging. It depends on the level, on the degree to which they need to integrate. It depends on the kind of information they have to integrate. So this is an ongoing process, absolutely.
My last quick comment is that comparing the, you know, the macaque, monkeys, or some other non-primate species versus the infant, you know, have you looked into the occipital frontal fasciculus, you know, the superior longitudinal and inferior longitudinal fasciculus, you know, in terms of their, you know, language perception development?
We have not done that. I will say this, that we just got an EEG system and we plan to start looking at the brain, but it's going to be a while, and we don't do the imaging, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and as Ed said in the talk before, the peak of hyperconnectivity differs for different parts of the brain.
Right,
So this
right.
process we're talking about is going to play out at many different developmental
Exactly.
timescales.
And I think that's a key point.
More questions? Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. I just have a couple of brief questions. The first is, do you link the behavioral effects that you see with individual differences? So do children that begin to babble later also show the shifts later? And the second, you have probably investigated so many children. Have you tried doing a prospective study and finding out which of these children later develop dyslexia? And are there any differences there?
Yeah. The individual difference questions are absolutely essential and fascinating. We have not done that yet, but it's in the planning stages, especially with regard to babbling. Babbling is a little bit hard to elicit in the lab, so we have to figure out how you go about doing this. Parental reports, I suppose, you could do, although I prefer to get the real behavior. So that is definitely planned for us. And in terms of doing the prospective, we have not done that, unfortunately, because the problem is that we run different studies with different babies, and so that requires a completely different protocol. We have not done that, but yeah, I think those questions are really important.
And I think there's another problem. When we do studies with infants, they're designed so the results of the group give us the answer. They're not really designed to measure individual differences, right? So you're looking for a 60% preference for something, and you'll get variable responses. But if you retested the babies on a different day, they're not going to replicate themselves in terms whether they were a 55% baby or a 75% baby. So that's a problem in doing longitudinal studies. We don't have sensitive measures of individual differences.
Of course, they've already changed the next day.
That's true. They changed because they were in the experiment.
They were in the experiment, but also the nervous system is changing, their experience is changing. So it's a mess. It's hard it's a moving target, right?
Is there a question on that side of the room?
I think there's a question there.
Hi, it's another neurological question as you phrased it. So do your data suggest that they may this integration, audiovisual integration, may be happening in a specific area, like, for instance, the area we saw in the previous talk of grapheme color connections? Is there any other evidence from outside your work or the ones that you...
One of the things that we want to actually start looking at is STS, supratemporal cortex, because I think that those are the areas that in the temporal cortex that have been identified as the multisensory areas that respond to auditory, visual, and somatosensory information, and that's where the integration is going on, particularly with respect to speech and language. So we're very interested in looking at those areas, in particular in relation to this lip reading that we're finding now. It would be really fascinating to see whether, in fact, those areas begin to actually become active as babies start to selectively attend to the face, the mouth of the person who's talking. So yeah, that's definitely something we want to start looking at. And I would look there first.
David, I have a question. I have trouble putting together the general principles you outlined with one finding. So temporal synchrony is a very powerful cue.
Mm-hmm.
Bilingual babies, and even your unilingual babies, are continuing to use it when the language is unfamiliar. They're still continuing to look at the mouth. Mm-hmm. So presumably that's because they're picking up the temporal synchrony. Mm-hmm. So what happens with monkey faces? At 8 and 10 months, when the babies are no longer looking at the congruent visual stimulus, but there's very powerful temporal synchrony, mm-hmm. and we get it as adults based on temporal synchrony. Mm-hmm. So how does that fit into your general scheme?
Synchrony is it turns out, I've been thinking a lot about this problem, and it turns out that synchrony, the story behind synchrony is getting very complicated. So one of the things I didn't share with you here is that synchrony, by the time you get to be a year of age, synchrony starts to play a lesser role. It continues to play a role, and it continues to play a role into adulthood when we need to hold on for dear life. So if other systems were to fail us, we tend to resort to those lower level mechanisms. But in terms of development, it seems like I'm starting to believe that there is a complex interplay between synchrony and prosody, for example. So as I pointed out here, when it's unfamiliar speech, then babies actually need it. And do they use it together with prosody to recognize the coherence? Do they use it by itself? We don't know at this point. So there are interactions there. And I can't answer that question from an empirical standpoint yet. But yes, I absolutely recognize what you're raising as a very, very key question.
It might be a case if at 8 months you immerse them in monkey language,
Mhm.
it would not take very
Yeah.
long for temporal synchrony
Yeah.
to start being used again.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, what you're referring to here are the training studies. So one of the things we haven't talked about is that there are a number of studies in the literature, training studies, where if you expose babies to these unfamiliar stimuli, like monkey faces, for example, for 3 months, during the period that they're just starting to narrow and their responsiveness, discriminative responsiveness declines, if you give them extra exposure, it comes back. They can start to discriminate them again. So the system is very plastic, in fact. And one of the things that I always like to point out is that when perceptual narrowing occurs, it's not a loss of anything. It's a decline in the ability to handle certain kinds of inputs, but obviously a great deal of plasticity remains. Otherwise, we couldn't learn foreign languages.
You can easily get it back
Yeah.
with a little bit of training in
Correct.
12 months. Takes
Correct.
more training in adulthood.
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for a
Thank you.
very stimulating presentation.